There is a company that once stood shoulder to shoulder with Harley-Davidson and Indian that set a world speed record neither of them could touch first, that forced both of those giants to redesign their motorcycles just to keep up, and that most riders alive today have never heard of. Not because it failed, not because it built bad machines, but because one morning in 1931, with a full order book, with dealers waiting, with money still coming in the door, the owner walked into a room full of his own department heads and said 5 words that ended everything before lunch. No warning, no slow decline you could see coming. One meeting, one sentence, and one of America's great motorcycle companies simply stopped existing. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what he said, why he said it, and why almost nobody remembers a company that, for a few wild years, was genuinely faster than both Harley and Indian combined. To understand how something this big could disappear this completely, you have to go back to a bicycle shop in Chicago, because that is where this story actually begins. And it does not begin with a motorcycle at all. Ignaz Schwinn arrived in the United States from Germany in the 1890s with mechanical training and almost nothing else. He landed in Chicago at exactly the right moment, because America was in the middle of a bicycle craze, and by 1895 he had co-founded Arnold, Schwinn and Company, a bicycle manufacturer that would eventually become one of the most recognizable names in the history of American cycling. If you rode a Schwinn bike as a kid, or your parents did, or your grandparents did, this is the same company, but bicycle booms do not last forever, and by the early 1900s the market was crashing hard. Hundreds of bicycle makers went under. Schwinn's own business partner walked away, convinced the good years were over. Most people in his position would have played it safe. Ignaz Schwinn did the opposite. He looked at the wreckage of the bicycle industry and decided the future was not pedal power, it was engine power. In 1911, Schwinn bought a struggling motorcycle manufacturer called the Excelsior Motor Manufacturing and Supply Company for $500,000, a genuinely enormous sum at the time. On paper, it looked like a bicycle man buying a side project. In reality, Schwinn had just placed a bet that would make Excelsior one of the fastest, most technically advanced motorcycle brands in the country, operating quietly under the ownership of a business the public only ever associated with children's bikes. That is the first piece of the secret. The company building some of the quickest motorcycles in America in the 1910s was, behind the scenes, funded and run by the same man building your bicycle. Now here's where it gets interesting, because Schwinn did not just want Excelsior to survive, he wanted it to win. And in 1912, it did something neither Harley-Davidson nor Indian had managed to do. An Excelsior motorcycle, ridden by Lee Humiston, became the first motorcycle in recorded history to be officially timed at 100 miles an hour. Not close to it, not almost. Officially, on the record, 100 miles an hour, at a time when most cars on American roads could barely manage half that speed. Think about what that means for a company most people today couldn't name if you gave them 3 guesses. While Harley-Davidson was still a scrappy operation building a few thousand bikes a year out of Milwaukee, and Indian was the established king of the American market. This bicycle company's motorcycle division had just set a benchmark that would define motorcycle performance for the next generation, and this record was not a fluke. Excelsior became a genuine force on the board tracks, the steeply banked wooden ovals where motorcycle racing drew crowds that rival some of today's biggest live sporting events. These tracks were brutal, splinter-filled death traps, and the men who raced on them were treated like gladiators. Excelsior's factory team went toe-to-toe with Harley's famous racing squad and Indian's factory riders, and it won often enough that trade newspapers of the era started referring to Indian, Harley-Davidson, and Excelsior as the big 3 of American motorcycling. Not the big 2 and a smaller company hanging around the edges. The big 3 companies, one from Springfield, one from Milwaukee, one from Chicago, and journalists at the time genuinely could not agree which one would come out on top. By 1913, Excelsior was producing something in the range of 11,000 motorcycles a year, running neck and neck with Harley-Davidson's production numbers of that same period, while Indian sat comfortably ahead of both of them. Read that again. A company most riders today have never heard of was keeping pace with Harley-Davidson, motorcycle for motorcycle, at a moment when Harley-Davidson was already becoming a household name. That is not a small regional manufacturer scraping by. That is a legitimate national competitor fighting for the same dealers, the same customers, and the same headlines as the two brands that are still massive today. But here is the part of the story that should really stop you in your tracks. And it is the part that makes this so much stranger than fiction. When the United States entered the First World War, the government needed motorcycles for messenger duty, reconnaissance, and military transport across brutal terrain. It turned to exactly three companies to supply them at scale: Indian, Harley-Davidson, and Excelsior. This tiny, secretly bicycle-owned company was trusted by the United States military to help supply the war effort, standing in the same room as two brands that are now worth billions of dollars and celebrated in museums around the world. Indian, in fact, overcommitted so heavily to military production that it gutted its own domestic dealer network and never fully recovered its pre-war dominance. Excelsior weathered the war years more carefully and came out the other side still standing strong, still building fast, well-engineered machines, still very much in the fight. Then in 1917, Schwinn made another move that quietly reshaped the entire landscape. He bought the Henderson Motorcycle Company, a manufacturer famous for building the smoothest, most luxurious inline four-cylinder motorcycles in America, machines favored by wealthy riders and long-distance record breakers. Henderson bikes had already set transcontinental speed records, crossing the country coast to coast faster than almost anything else on two wheels. Schwinn folded Henderson into Excelsior, merged their engineering talent, and consolidated everything into one Chicago factory. Overnight, without most of the public even fully registering the shift, Excelsior-Henderson became a company capable of building both a screaming, race-bred V-twin and a silky smooth luxury four-cylinder tourer under the same roof. Two completely different kinds of motorcycle excellence, owned by a bicycle company, hiding in plain sight. If you think that is the peak of the story, wait, because it gets even bolder. In 1925, an engineer named Arthur Constantine walked into Harley-Davidson's offices with an idea for a brand new mid-sized V-twin motorcycle designed to compete directly with the Indian Scout. Harley's leadership turned him down flat and reprimanded him for wasting company time on an unauthorized project. So Constantine did something that must have felt almost unthinkable at the time. He quit Harley-Davidson, walked his rejected design straight over to Excelsior, and Excelsior said yes. The result was the Excelsior Super X, America's first 45 cubic inch V-twin motorcycle, and it was good enough that it genuinely rattled both of Excelsior's much larger rivals. Indian was forced to enlarge its Scout engine to keep pace. Harley-Davidson was forced to rush its own 45 cubic inch machine into production, the model that would eventually become one of the most important engine families in Harley's entire history. Sit with that for a second. A design that Harley-Davidson itself rejected became successful enough at a smaller competitor that Harley had to scramble and copy the very idea it had turned away. That is not a footnote. That is a company punching so far above its supposed weight class that it was setting the pace for an entire industry, not just chasing it. By 1928, trade publications still ranked Excelsior in third place nationally, behind Indian and Harley-Davidson in total volume, but only barely, and still very much a serious, respected, technically ambitious manufacturer with a loyal following and a full lineup of competitive machines. This was not a company on its last legs. This was a company still innovating, still racing, still selling, still very much part of the conversation about who built the best motorcycles in America. And then, almost without warning, the entire world underneath it collapsed. In October of 1929, the stock market crashed, and the effects rippled through every industry in the country, including motorcycles almost immediately. Sales of high-priced machines, exactly the kind of premium motorcycles Excelsior and Henderson specialized in, fell off a cliff. Harley-Davidson barely survived the early years of the Depression, kept afloat in part by an unusual overseas cash arrangement. Indian only made it through because the wealthy DuPont family stepped in and took control of the company. These were desperate years, even for the biggest names in the business. Ignaz Schwinn, now well past 70 years old, watched all of this happen with the eyes of a man who had already lived through one industry collapse decades earlier, when the bicycle boom of his youth turned into a bicycle bust almost overnight. He believed, correctly as it turned out, that this new depression was not going to be a short dip. He believed it could drag on for years, possibly close to a decade. And he was not interested in slowly bleeding out, watching a business he had built from nothing get whittled down piece by piece. He tried to find a buyer for the entire motorcycle operation, Nobody was willing or able to take it on in the middle of a collapsing economy. So in the summer of 1931, with absolutely no public announcement, no press release, no warning to dealers, no warning even to most of his own senior staff, Ignaz Schwinn called a meeting of his department heads at the Excelsior-Henderson factory in Chicago. The company still had a full order book at that moment. Dealers across the country were still expecting shipments. Motorcycles were still on the production line, and in that room, Schwinn looked at the men who had built one of America's great motorcycle brands alongside him for 2 decades, and he said, quote, "Gentlemen, today we stop." That was it. That was the entire announcement. No transition period. No winding down over months. No final farewell model or victory lap. Production simply ended, effective almost immediately, and by September of 1931, all motorcycle manufacturing at Excelsior-Henderson had ceased completely. A company that had set the first officially timed 100-mile-an-hour run in motorcycle history, that had stood in the so-called Big Three, alongside Harley-Davidson and Indian, that had supplied the United States military in wartime, that had forced Harley-Davidson to copy an idea it once rejected, was simply gone in the space of a single meeting, on the say-so of one man who had decided he was done. Here's the detail that makes this story almost impossible to believe if you did not already know it happened. Ignaz Schwinn did not shut down the motorcycle business because it was failing in isolation. Every serious account of that meeting agrees on this. Orders were still on the books. Dealers still wanted product. He shut it down because he looked at the broader economy, made a cold, calculated judgment about how long the pain was going to last, and decided the smartest move was to cut losses immediately rather than fight a war of attrition he believed he could not win. He turned the company's full attention back to bicycles, handed active leadership to his son Frank, and within a few years the Schwinn name was once again synonymous with the bicycle industry, eventually becoming one of the most dominant and beloved bicycle brands in American history. The same company, the same family. The same factory floor that had once built machines chasing 100 miles an hour on a wooden racetrack now went all in on children's bicycles, and it worked spectacularly well. Which brings us to the real reason almost nobody remembers this. Excelsior-Henderson did not fade away through slow irrelevance the way so many forgotten brands do. It did not get bought out and diluted into a corporate afterthought. It got switched off deliberately, at the height of its technical relevance, by a man who chose long-term survival over short-term pride. And then that same company reinvented itself so successfully as a bicycle brand that the motorcycle chapter got buried underneath decades of Schwinn bicycles rolling out of driveways all across America. Ask almost anyone today what Schwinn makes, and they will say bicycles, maybe stationary bikes if they are being specific. Almost nobody will tell you that the same company once built one of the fastest, most respected motorcycles in the country, stood level with Harley-Davidson and Indian in the eyes of the trade press, and then vanished from that industry in the time it takes to hold a single staff meeting. So the next time you see a vintage Excelsior or Henderson motorcycle sitting quietly in a museum or a private collection somewhere, understand what you're actually looking at. You are not looking at some obscure side project from a forgotten company. You are looking at proof that one of the biggest names in American bicycle history was, for a couple of decades, secretly running one of the most capable motorcycle operations in the country, fast enough to set records neither Harley nor Indian could claim first, respected enough to be trusted by the United States military, and influential enough to force Harley-Davidson into copying a design it had originally turned down. And then, on one ordinary day in 1931, with the order book still full, it all ended on 5 words nobody in that room saw coming. That is the part of motorcycle history that never makes it into the mainstream story, and it is exactly why it is worth telling.